Hello, and welcome to this installment of Let's Learn Ruby. Today we'll be learning about objects, classes, and object-oriented programming. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. So, why do we care? What motivates us to learn these concepts, objects, classes, and object-oriented programming? Well, for one, object-oriented programming is a core programming concept, and a big part of Ruby. Technically, you don't need to know object-oriented programming in order to do and code in Ruby, but if you don't know it, then you'll be missing out on utilizing the full power that Ruby has to offer. Also, OOP concepts are used in practice in feature files and spec files for regression and unit testing and automated testing. When we're doing this, we're actually applying the concepts of OOP under the hood, whenever we do automated testing, that is. So if you know OOP, then you'll have a clearer understanding of how automated testing sort of does what it does, if you're into that sort of thing. Also, OOP is basically everywhere. It's used in many languages, not just in Ruby, also Java, JavaScript, and Python, just to name a few. And it's used in many programming industries, such as automated testing, web development, front-end, back-end, mobile. It's pretty much implied that you'll know at least the basics of object-oriented programming when you dive into these industries. So yeah, I feel like there are plenty of reasons why one should learn object-oriented programming. So let's start with the definition. What exactly is this term, this mumbo-jumbo of words that seem to suggest something called object-oriented programming? Well, if you trust Wikipedia, it defines object-oriented programming as a programming paradigm based on the concept of objects. Now, a programming paradigm is nothing more than a way to classify programming languages based on their features. So, object-oriented programming is nothing more than a class of programming languages that features these things called objects. So this all leads to questioning, what exactly is an object anyway? Well, in the early days of software, whenever object-oriented programming first came about, an object in terms of programming was initially meant to mimic or simulate or represent a real-world object. So let's look at a real-world object in depth for a second. Here's a puppy. This puppy has some attributes. It has big eyes, small paws, probably has a name, an age, and dog ears, tan and black fur, what have you. It also has behaviors, like right now, it's sitting in a cup, staring into the camera, probably wiggling around, licking its snout, so on and so forth. So, this puppy has a set of attributes and behaviors. Similarly, here's another real-world object, a car. This car has some attributes attributed to it as well. It has a color, make and model of the car, number of seats. It also has behaviors. You could drive a car, park it, slow it down, accelerate. So, both of these guys have a set of attributes and a set of behaviors associated with them. So, an object in terms of programming can be thought of as some data that has certain attributes and behaviors, so that it may do things such as represent a car or a dog or whatever you want to object you wish to represent in memory. So, an object is merely some data stored in memory that has some attributes and behaviors. So how do we use any of this OOP knowledge and theory in order to apply it and create our own objects and do our own things? How do we create objects of our own? Well, let's go back to our car analogy. What do we need before we have any physical parts of the car in order to build or create a car? Before we have any physical parts at all, like the driver's seat, the wheels, dashboard, anything. We'll need a blueprint of the car. A blueprint that'll tell us all the features the car will have, all the attributes and behaviors that a car can do. Similarly, we'll need a blueprint in order to make any programming object. The name for a blueprint in order to create an object in programming is called a class. A class is a blueprint or a template for creating objects, as I've just said. It'll tell us the attributes and behaviors that a particular object can have, and it'll be up to the designer or the developer of a class to determine what attributes and behaviors this blueprint, this class of objects will have. So let's go ahead and design our own class so that we can create our own objects. Go to your favorite text editor here. I'm going to go nice and simple and go with Notepad++, but you can use RubyMine or whatever tool you wish to create classes. So the way we tell Ruby that we want to create a class is through giving the class keyword followed by the name of the class. Let's create a class of dogs. Let's create some dogs. And every class in Ruby is also a Ruby block, so you have to end every class with the end keyword. Let's go ahead and be nice and safe here and save the file that we have right now. I'm going to go ahead and save it as a Ruby dog example. And every Ruby Ruby file has to end with the extension r.rb, so I'm going to go ahead and save it like that. And I'm going to go ahead into the command prompt and go into the directory that the file we just created is in. So I'm going to go to there and check that the file is there and go ahead and run the file. There you go, nothing broke, so this is proper Ruby syntax right now. But this doesn't really tell us anything because this class is empty, it doesn't have any attributes or behaviors. So let's go ahead and give it some. The way you give class attributes in Ruby is to give it variables. So let's give this guy some attributes. Let's give this dog a name and an age. So let's save this guy right here and run him in our command prompt, the same file. And looks like Ruby doesn't like what we just did. So as it turns out, Ruby doesn't accept local variables, these guys that we just created, into its classes. It'll only accept other types of variables, one of which is instance variables. And what instance variables basically means is that it'll create, for each object that you create out of this class, it'll create a specific name and an age for each object of dog. We'll get into what I just said later. But for right now, let's just give this dog its attributes and confirm in the command prompt that Ruby is happy with what we just made. So let's run the same command again. And there you go. Ruby didn't complain, which means we're happy. Now let's give this dog some behaviors. And the way you give behaviors to classes in Ruby is through giving it functions. So let's make this dog bark. And let's make him go woof woof to the command prompt and save this guy and run him in the command prompt to see if Ruby will yell at us for bad syntax. There you go. Ruby didn't complain, which means we're happy. So let's go ahead and give this dog one more behavior so that we can have at least two behaviors in it. So let's give this dog the ability to howl, and let's make him howl at the command prompt. Okay, yeah, that's close enough. And so we could say, we can put a comment here and say that this dog has some behaviors to them. And let's go into the command prompt to see if we have some correct syntax. There you go, Ruby is not complaining, so which means we're happy. So what we just did was create a class of dog. So now what we can do is create an object based on this class, this blueprint that we just created of a dog. So let's go ahead and make our first Ruby object. The way we do that is by giving the class name, the name of the blueprint, and invoking the .new command. And what this does is it creates a new object based on the class that you give it. So this will create a new class of dogs based on how we defined a class of dog up here. So how do we see this? Well, let's assign a variable, let's call it dog1, and give it the value of this newly created dog object. So what this dog variable will have, this dog1 variable will have, is have all the attributes and behaviors of this dog. One of the things you can do with newly created objects is call any method that the object has. The object has two methods based on the class, the blueprint that it was given. So let's call the bark method. How do we do that? We use the dot operator. So, for example, dog1.bark. And what the dot operator essentially allows us to do is to call any methods in an object. And we know that this object has these two methods because it was given from this class. So right now we're calling the bark method in this dog1 object. So if we go ahead and run this file, what's going to happen before I press enter is that Ruby is going to go line by line, and it sees on line 1 that it sees the keyword class. So it's going to see that a class is being created. So it's going to go from line 1 to line 16 and create this class. And then it'll go ahead and see line 18 and see that an object is being created based on this class and passed into this dog variable. And on the next line, one of the object's methods is being used. So what should happen in the end is that this dog object should bark at us from the command line. And let's go ahead and run this guy. And there you go. Things happened as expected, and we were able to call a method of an object. Now it's important to note that we can only call methods from an object. We're not allowed to directly call attributes. So for example, if I try to call this dog's name and get the name of that dog, then in the command line I won't be able to... What's going to happen is Ruby's going to yell at me. So let's try it out and see what happens. So it went line by line again, and it saw this, it barked, the dog barked at me and it went woof. But at line 21 we see that we get an undefined method name for the dog, and just to drive the point home, even though we didn't add the @ symbol here that you see, let's go ahead and add this guy in. We'll see that we'll still get some sort of error whenever we try to run this file. There you go, syntax error. So the way we've written our class right now is that there's actually no way to get these attributes from this object. So what we can do about this is to define a method that'll give us each individual attribute. So let's define a method that'll give us that name, getName, and it'll return us that instance variable of that name. So if we get the name and then print this out into the command prompt, we'll see that we can get something of value. Let's see here. Woof woof, and there you go. We get an extra empty space because we didn't provide a name for the dog yet. So the only thing we can do right now is get the name of the dog. So in order to access the name of the dog, we'll have to define another method to set the name of the dog. And what this will do is it will give us a name of the dog that we provide for it in the setName parameters. So let's call this name we give, and let's set the instance variable of this dog's name to the name that we give. So instead of doing this, let us grab that dog object and set the name of that dog to Fido. And then now this dog has a name. So now if we run dog1.getName, we'll see that this dog object's name has been set to Fido. And if we run this command, there you go, dog's name is Fido. So what we've essentially done here is give read permissions to this variable, this attribute called name, read permissions for name, and this other method we've given it the ability to have write permissions. We're changing the name every time we invoke the setName method. So you can see that this will be tedious if we have to write read and write permissions for each attribute, especially if a class has more than 2 attributes, maybe 10 or 20 or 100. So a little workaround that Ruby does actually is this. Ruby has a few special keywords for classes so that we can shortcut the number of methods that we write if we want to give read and write permissions to each attribute. One of them is attr reader. Listen closely. Attribute reader is a special method that you can put within classes in Ruby so that when you give it a variable, it'll give you both an instance variable and it'll also write out for you the read permissions method in the form of this. So what happens is that whenever we pass in a variable into attribute reader, it'll create both this guy and this guy. So just to be clear, an instance variable named name and a read permissions method named name will get created whenever we call attribute reader. And it's important to note also, this is very important, that it won't accept just any variable name. It'll only accept the variable name in the form of a symbol, which we learned previously. So if we comment these guys out, and since attribute reader gives us a method name instead of getName, we can change this guy to just name. The file should run the exact same way that it did before. So let's go into our command prompt and run this exact same file. and see that we have the exact same output. We got the value Fido using this method, which was obtained after we ran the attribute reader, which gave us implicitly this method name as well as the attribute instance variable. So we can go ahead and delete these guys, and just to confirm, let's save the file and run it again to the command prompt, see if we get the same output. And we do. All is well. So now there's a corresponding keyword here that we could use to write out writer methods for us, and that keyword is attribute writer. And we also pass it that instance variable, that symbol, and what it'll do is it'll also create an instance variable, and it'll write out this guy. But since we already have an instance variable named name given in reader in this method, then an instance variable won't be Ruby smart enough to not create two instance variables of the same name. So what it'll do is it'll create this. It'll write out for us implicitly this setter method, but the setter method won't look like set name. It'll look a little fancy. It'll look like this. And what this syntax is, I'll just put this guy over here just to be clear. And delete this. So what this syntax will do, actually, let's set this guy back to this guy to make it more clear, is that instead of passing variables into the method as a parameter, we can just pass in variables as if as if this guy was a variable in itself. It's just a little Ruby quirk that you have to get used to because it's kind of used everywhere. So what attribute writer does is that it writes out for you a method, a writer permission method or a setter method with this syntax, and it'll do that implicitly. So if we comment this guy out, this program should run the same. So let's go ahead and execute the program, see what we get. And there you go, same output, and we're happy. So let's delete this guy real quick. And now we have keywords that will respectively give us reader and writer permissions. And we can do this for all of our attributes. So let's give this to age as well as writer permissions to age. But since reading and writing permissions is so common to give both of them at once, there's another special keyword in Ruby that you can give both reader and writer permissions, and that keyword is attribute accessor. And what this guy will essentially do is do both of these guys' jobs at once. And so instead of doing it in 2 lines and rewriting all the attributes, remember you can have more than 2, you can have hundreds maybe, you can just write them all out in 1 line, so there is 0 duplication of any code. So we can delete this guy, and this age instance variable was already created in this accessor method, so we can delete this guy as well, and there we have it. We've created a list of attributes that have reader and writer permissions. So these guys are our list of attributes with read and write permissions. And if we run this guy, we'll see that if he runs, the file runs the same. There we go, we have the same output. There's one more important thing to learn in Ruby about objects and classes, and that is the initialize method. Those of you familiar with Java will see this as very similar to the constructor. So initialize, this method is unique in that it will be called whenever you first initialize the object. So whenever the .new method is called, this initialize method will also be called. And a popular usage of initialize is the initialize method is to initialize the attributes that you have in the object. So let's assign initial values to age and name, and if we want to do that, we have to pass in an initial age. Well, let's start up here. An initial name and an initial age, And if we want to pass in values into initialize, we have to do so with the new method. So let's go ahead and give an initial name of the same name, Fido, and an initial age of 2. And we want to pass these initial names into the instance variables so that the instance variables will have these values as soon as the object is created. So what's going to happen is Fido and 2 will be passed into init name and init age and initialize, and they will immediately be passed into these instant variables as soon as the object gets created. So we can delete this guy now because we no longer need him since our name is already set to Fido. And if we run the program, we'll see that it works exactly as it did before. And there we go. We still get the same output in. We see that our dog's name is still Fido and that we are still barking. Good. So just to recap, we defined what object-oriented programming was, we defined what an object is, and we defined what classes were. And we dived in deep and we wrote classes in Ruby, and we figured out how to write a class with attributes and behaviors. We learned about instance variables. We created our own objects through our own classes that we custom built, and we called methods from objects using the dot operator. And we also learned about some certain keywords in key methods that you can write in classes in Ruby to make our lives easier: attribute reader, writer, and accessor. And we also learned about the initialize method that gets called whenever you first initialize or create a new object. Thank you. That's all for now. I hope you found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next one.